J.B. Hawes. For those of you who don't know who he is, this is his first of how many books? I know there's at least one more coming, but he's so young that he's probably got at least 10 books in him, I would think. He's a fine young man. He has, I was noticing all the schools that he's gone to, BYU, Weber, and you got your degree in American history at the U. I guess consciously avoided going to Utah State. Sorry, Chris. All of my
it's a worthiness.
worthiness. All of my kids have one time or another gone to Utah State. I couldn't get any of them to go to the Y. I don't know why that is, but JB teaches.
Smart kids.
Yeah, smart kids. And in my neighborhood up in East Mill Creek, you take your life in your hands if you put a Y out on your grass or let anybody know that you could possibly be a cougar. But anyway, he's been through, it's like a sentence in CES. I meant that through the CES system, he has taught seminary, and he's currently a professor at BYU of church history. But the greatest part of all, in addition to those things, and that he's produced a fine and interesting book that talks about the Mormon moment, which is now several years long, right? But he looks at the image of Mormonism in America for over a period of many years. And just so you know, if you look in the back there and see that he's a native of a certain town in northern Utah, don't make the mistake of calling it Hooper, okay? Because his dad and I were missionary companions in the South twice. I don't know which one of us didn't get it right the first time, but they put us together twice. But he made it very clear to me that it's Hooper and not Hooper. And I said, well, he says, you know, like in book. And I said, well, you mean like in Gary Cooper? Anyways, we argued about it, but who knows why it's called Hooper. But then there's Hurricane and, you know, Man Away, and you don't even want to go down there that road. Some nice endorsements for the book, published, by the way, by Oxford University Press, which is quite an accomplishment. Not that they finally got it published, but that it's a prestigious university press. They do, I don't know how many they do, but I would guess they probably do 500 books a year, don't you think? Do you have any idea? And then once in a while they come out with a really good one. But he has, Terrell Gibbons, for example, calls JB's effort here an engaging account of Mormonism's 50-year journey out of the wilderness. J.B. Hawes presents a lively story of a modern church's transition from building bunkers to bridges, thorough and judicious, and a number of other very complimentary blurbs, as we call them in the business. So I recommend the book. I'd like to now turn the time over to J.B. Hawes, who we're very pleased not only to have an author of, and I'll say, even though it's his first book, I'll say of his caliber, but I do have to mention that not just that his dad was my missionary companion, but a very close friend, who's actually, he and Debbie are on a mission now in Missouri, and for some reason they couldn't get it off for tonight, so they're not here. But and JB's wife Laura is here. We welcome all family, and I assume that 90% of you are probably related to him. Right? My pleasure now to give you J.B. Hawes.
Well, thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to those of you who've come and may have just wandered in and stayed, so I appreciate that.
I guess I should give you the microphone. Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
It'd be my luck to walk down to the restroom and like in the movie. Never mind. So, yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Can you hear him okay?
Should move a little closer. Is that right?
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. Well, I really am excited to talk with you about the project, and I hope we'll have some questions and answers. I'm always interested in hearing about people's perceptions about this period in Mormon history, because all of us in here have lived it. So I'm always interested to hear your thoughts on how you've seen things shape out. I think it's an intriguing topic. You know, in terms of biographical details, there's very few things that are worth knowing about me. But one of those is that I'm married to Laura, which I always bring up first. And then the second is that I'm from Hooper. And has everyone heard of Hooper? Is there anyone who has not heard of Hooper? So it's this inferiority complex about our town that we just insist on repeatedly bringing it up. You know, it's just this lovely little town just west of Ogden. It's a lot like San Diego with a few more cows, but it's right on the beaches of the Great Salt Lake. So it's just this wonderful resort town. It's a good time of year to visit because the tourists have gone home, so you can take a trip up there. Hooper relates to this story because in 1982, President Ronald Reagan visited Hooper, Utah. And September 10th, 1982, it's a date that will, you know, forever emblazoned on our minds when we're from Hooper. I was in the second grade. They canceled school. I remember going to the Hooper Park and being there when President Reagan came. Come to find out, they were just looking for a park that was fully fenced, and our town happened to have that. So, you know, we would hope it was something more glorious than that. But he still came. He'd been at the Ogden Cannery, the LDS Cannery, and with President Hinckley, and then wanted to give a speech. And he was very complimentary of the church's welfare program, and at the Hooper speech he said something to the effect that if the entire nation would have done what the LDS Church had done, there would be no need for government welfare. So a politically charged statement, but also highly complimentary of the LDS Church. And that's something intriguing as part of the story. Maybe two other mid-'80s snapshots. When I was 10, BYU won the national championship in football in 1984, and this was the first year that I really started following BYU football, and I just was so enamored with the team, and still am way too into BYU football. But I remember even as a kid having this sense that so much of the reporting around BYU football, things about Mormonism came up. And they would talk about returned missionaries on the team. They would talk about the honor code, and it just seemed even then I just had the sense that there's something important going on with the BYU exposure. And then that same year, Charlene Wells was crowned Miss America, and a BYU student. And so it's kind of this university publicist's dream. I mean, this same thing happened this year. And so fast forward 20 years, and I'm at the University of Utah and working on dissertation ideas, and I came back to these moments, these mid-'80s moments, and I was really intrigued with the effect of BYU football, especially this national championship season, on how it affected people's opinions of Mormons. So I proposed that to my advisor. And somehow he thought that focusing on one season of BYU football was a little too narrow for a dissertation. He was kind of an unreasonable guy, but I just had to bring this. Does he not realize that there's a book written about one single BYU game, an entire book, about the BYU Miami game? I hope Benchmark Books carries this, so you can look for this tonight. Call Me the Storm, yeah. Oh, Hooper and Sons of the Ditches, that's right, yes.
His father wrote this one,
yeah.
Hooper and its Sons of Ditches.
Yeah, if you want to know more than you've ever wanted to know about Hooper, you can check out that book. So my advisor pushed me to go a little broader than just one season of BYU football, so I, kind of grudgingly accepted that advice. But so then I was also interested in interfaith things. I had a sense just from working with a few of the professors at BYU from, when I was a student, some of the things that they were doing, especially with evangelical Christians, and I thought it would be really interesting to see how that's going. My advisor still wisely was like, that's probably still a little too narrow, but I owe so much to Bob Goldberg at the U, who pushed me to think in terms of all of this as pieces of a larger dialogue. And so Bob's idea was, why don't you let's take this and frame this whole story about all of these as elements in a dialogue of perception making. And so, as I said, hats off to him, and he was the one who came up with the idea, suggested the framing of George Romney running for president, and then Mitt Romney running for president. And a lot of credit goes to him for helping kind of conceive of this study, and it turned out to be a fascinating story. As many of you know, and you probably remember, when George Romney ran for president, his Mormonism just wasn't that big of a deal. He was someone who was respected for his piety and his high moral standards and his family values. And so many factors go into that, but at least part of it was that he ran for president in this decade that was post John F. Kennedy, that was in the spirit of Vatican II in this high ecumenical moment, but it was also importantly he ran for president in this climate of the pre-religious right era, and so it seems that a lot of this story turns on the rise of evangelical Christianity as a political force in the early 1980s. Which brings us back to the story of President Reagan. Many evangelical Christians saw President Reagan's victory in the 1980 election as a referendum on conservative politics, but also on their inclusion in the political process. And there were some that spoke very broadly about their role in delivering the victories of President Reagan. But at the same time, President Reagan had this obvious esteem for Mormons and some of these publicized things, and he was bringing Mormons onto his team, his administration team, and so it just highlighted the tension of what was happening in the 1980s. So real briefly, what we could say is Bruce Olson, who was the managing director of the Church's Public Affairs, who retired in 2008, he used a phrase that I like the phrase. He called the President McKay's administration the golden era of Mormonism in terms of public esteem. And it just seemed like that Mormonism really resonated with the American ethos of the time, that they were, as Jan Shipp said, the real Leave It to Beaver families. And so nothing seemed threatening about Mormonism. It seemed like it had been tamed politically. It was industrious people. It was the welfare program. It was taking care of their own. It was high patriotism. And if anything, Mormonism seemed pretty benign. And most, even scholars of religion who looked at Mormonism thought that it might be obsolete. It might just be slowly, becoming one of the many denominations. So that as that feeling drifts through the 60s and is reflected in George Romney's campaign, he kind of embodies that. 3 moments, I think, sort of become the pivot. And this is an oversimplification, but it works well when we're having a short talk. So the church opposes the Equal Rights Amendment. This home front decade was really crucial. Even with some of the protests that surrounded Brigham Young University sports in '69 and '70 and '71 over the priesthood prohibition policy, and this became really publicized because of George Romney's campaign and then because of these protests at sporting events. That was this moment where the church was really worried, it seems, about getting a racist label. Ironically, that seemed to diminish pretty quickly because of some national factors too. There seemed to be just this feeling that with the civil rights legislation that the nation was ready to move on. The protest culture seemed pretty tired, and then people became a little fed up with this. President Nixon runs on this sort of running a strict legal crime and punishment type campaign. So the nation seemed to be moving away from that, but the church realized that they didn't have a positive marker. There was something missing. They commissioned a survey in 1973 of 6 major metropolitan areas, and the thing that comes back most prominently is that people don't know about Mormons. People can't remember reading their literature. They can't remember having visits from Mormons. They just don't really have anything to associate with them beyond this sort of pioneer work ethic. And so the answer, the church's response is home front. And that changes everything. This becomes as successful a campaign as anything. Millions of dollars worth of free airtime as they capture this sort of space in FCC regulations for public service commercials, and they're brilliant. They just, we probably all remember those. And so by the end of the 70s, the church is known as, just has this family-friendly face. But that also becomes political in the 70s because of the Equal Rights Amendment. The church makes this decision to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment and does so pretty successfully. So we have the Boston Globe, for example, with a front page headline saying it's now do or die for the ERA, Mormon power is the key. And so this really sense that Mormons were playing a huge role. But then that faded really quickly for a bunch of reasons. Mormons don't seem to have there doesn't seem to be a long historical memory about Mormon involvement in the ERA. It's certainly not like other conservative Christians or Roman Catholics. Mormons kind of become a footnote. But what did seem to happen was that this alerted activists and journalists, and especially those who really opposed the Mormon position, to the fact that when Mormons wanted to, they could organize pretty effectively. And so with a few phone calls, thousands of women show up at these IWY meetings, the International Women's Year meetings, and they vote a certain way. And so that started some people saying, maybe we should be paying attention to this under-recognized Mormon power. This was still very much a subset. It seems like the family focus and the Reader's Digest inserts still were outplaying these cries for Mormon concerns about Mormons, until two things seemed to happen in the 80s. 1982, very tail end of the year, Godmakers comes out, and this becomes the most successful in terms of viewership and readership anti-Mormon campaign to date. And it has this model where it's being distributed and shown and screened in congregations and with the endorsement of pastors, so that thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in this evangelical subculture are viewing this film. And the film's message is that not only is Mormonism not authentic Christianity, but perhaps it's tied to Satanism or the occult, and that it's this carefully masked evil force. Evangelical Christians are feeling Mormons who are dedicating temples in Atlanta and Dallas in 80 and 81, and they're having missionary success, and Newsweek is reporting that 200 Baptists a day are joining the church, and all of this turf war is going on, and they feel this need to fight back, and Godmakers becomes the weapon. But it didn't seem to register outside of that subculture. It wasn't making a lot of national headlines until Mark Hoffman comes on the scene. And what seemed to change with the Mark Hoffman, the episode, the controversy around Mark Hoffman, was that these things like the ERA opposition and the Godmakers suddenly just exploded onto the front page of national periodicals, on national news shows, because of the scandal that Mark Hoffman and the bombings were, this crime and intrigue mixed together. And then it seemed like, because it was about historical documents and Mormon history, that somehow, perhaps what the activists around ERA were saying, or the filmmakers of Godmakers were saying, was somehow true, that maybe Mormons were secretive. They were hiding a dark underbelly, that perhaps there was more than this family facade. And this is where we might see the locus of a sharp downturn. So that while there's numbers can be all over the place, I think it's interesting. In 1977, a Gallup poll showed that 54% of Americans ranked Mormons favorably on a scale of sort of a temperature scale on how you feel Mormons. In 1991, the Barna organization asked a very similar question, and only 27% of Americans ranked Mormons favorably. So half over the course of that 14 years. President Hinckley comes on the scene and seems to just to really take on head-on all of these challenges, all of these reputational challenges, because of his openness, because of his comfort with the press. And a couple things happened, like the sesquicentennial pioneered wagon train that drew in attention, that unexpected, just incredible attention, but becomes this quintessential American story. The Olympics just turned out to be just an incredible boon for the Mormon public perception of Mormons. Just this really wonderful focus on Mormon people. So I think that a lot of us who observed this were a little surprised that when Mitt Romney runs for president in 2008, and leading up to this, that all of a sudden there seemed to be this groundswell of antipathy that was unexpected. Because it seemed like during President Hinckley's administration that a lot of that had been taken care of. A lot of that had been addressed. Where in what maybe I would suggest we're seeing happen is this sharp dichotomy between the image of Mormon individuals who are seen as these patriotic, maybe super American, family-friendly, great neighbors, versus the institution that is driving them, which may be somehow secretive, authoritarian. And so as this dichotomy widens, what happens in 2008 and to a lesser degree in 2012, but as Mitt Romney seems to be the face of this institutional Mormonism, not that he himself was institutional Mormonism, but that the vote became a referendum on how do we feel about this faith, and is it trustworthy? It's hard to separate the power of the presidency from the power of this institution. And so all of that seemed to just come back to the fore, the drama of the 1980s reprised. And we have maybe a little premature to jump in about 2012, but already it seems that 2012 felt a lot different than 2008. And a couple things that seemed to perhaps make it feel different were this idea of saturation. Kirk Jowers at the Hinckley Institute of Politics, such a savvy observer of all of this, is that he long before the 2012 campaign wondered if there would be a parallel between Mitt Romney's Senate race in Massachusetts versus his gubernatorial race, where the Senate race, some of the reporters felt like Kirk Jowers suggested they almost felt dirty, that they had dragged so much of this Mormonism through the mud, and so by that time they were ready to move on in 2002. In some ways it seemed like that happened. There was a saturation of the sensational, and that those stories had become tired, and the news media doesn't like old news. But I also think there was something strategic in the Church Public Affairs Department, their push in taking a really official, conscientious nonpartisanship, almost refusing to even mention Mitt Romney's name, and pushing journalists to do stories on lived Mormonism. And so after the campaigns, kind of with the campaigns and then right afterwards, it seems like the turn was to focus on what makes Mormons tick. Why do they do the things they do? What is it that we see the way this religion is manifested? So we have that great piece, the Brian Williams Rock Center piece, Mormon in America, that was focused on humanitarian and family life. And then we have the conventions where Mitt Romney's parishioners come and talk about his experience as a bishop. We have Ross Douthat of the New York Times looking at going out on inner city visits with a bishop. And suddenly Mormonism seemed to transcend the Mitt Romney story. And I think that's why, it was a little too celebratory, but I think it's interesting that the Associated Press runs this headline the day after the election, and the winner is the Mormon Church. Not that all of these problems or these antipathies or these tensions have gone away, but that perhaps the moment has moved past that to talk about other things about Mormonism. And then maybe one last thought. Matt Bowman, who another super perceptive observer, when he talked to NPR, he said something I think is really worth considering. He said perhaps the greatest thing that's come out of Mitt Romney's second campaign is to debunk the great myth of Mormonism, that it's a monolith. And you think about the types of voices who the press turned to as authentic Mormon voices, the diversity, or the fact that the Democratic National Convention focused on this Mormon Democrat caucus, or Harry Reid and coming out more publicly and addressing his faith and endorsing Greg Prince's op-ed. And so we get some really interesting things about the new looks at Mormon diversity. So I think all this comes down to Scott Swafford, who's now at BYU TV, and he was one of those instrumental in this development of the I'm a Mormon campaign. He said something that I think really captures where we're at now. Is he said he sees his work, his media work, as a funnel, that he's bringing everyone in the funnel. At the bottom of his funnel, is instead of convert, he thinks the verb is converse, and he says, I just want to be in the dialogue. And so perhaps more than anything after 50 years, what we would say is that the thing that seems to have changed is that Mormons, perhaps more than ever, are now part of this national dialogue about their own self-identity, but also about other things in American society. So I'm excited to see the next thing that happens in this dialogue. Thanks very much. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I thought we'd leave plenty of time for a question and answer. Yeah.
There's plenty of time.
Yeah, I certainly can say more, but you may not want to.
Yeah. What questions do you have?
Yeah, and if you don't ask questions, we'll go to round two. So, yeah, that's right. Alex.
Well, JB, you were down at BYU when Richard Land came down.
Yeah.
He seemed to indicate that the evangelical turnout and support of Romney was even greater than that of the LDS.
Yeah, that's true. It was
And
very
so-
close. I mean, we're talking like 2 percentage points, but I think the numbers came in that evangelicals by exit polls voted for Mitt Romney in the 78, high 78%, and Mormons were around 77. So really interesting.
But that at the beginning of the campaign, that was not the case.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean, it
right.
was very little support on that
Yeah.
end. But so, what do you see as changing that?
That's a great question. This brings up two really interesting issues. One of those was that I think there was a sense that maybe even in 2008, there was a sense from observers and even church officials that if Mitt Romney were to make it to a general campaign, that this could even turn out worse. That there would be all kinds of things trotted out that maybe wouldn't happen in the primary campaign. So the primary was definitely focused on sort of interreligious conflict. But what happens when it's now becomes Mormonism versus, say, liberal politics or sort of social justice or other things, all kinds of things, or feminism. The interesting thing is that didn't happen. That what was sort of predicted or maybe even feared didn't happen. After Mitt Romney secures the nomination, Joanna Brooks, her great line is almost became a religion-free campaign, which is, again, over-exaggeration, but it just reflects the fact that it just wasn't that big of a deal. So what seems interesting is that perhaps party loyalty and anti-President Obama sentiment trumped Mormon discomfort, so that there was this feeling of that electing a Mormon was somehow at least more palatable than voting for Barack Obama. But the interesting thing that I think that indicates is it will be hard to close that door. I think that they're perhaps this, especially with maybe the general populace as opposed to some of the ideological thinkers, that to go back on that, to reverse that trend, and to return to the way things maybe used to be, could reflect so poorly that the backlash, the public opinion backlash, is something that evangelical Christians won't do. That door now opened will not be closed again. But it will be interesting to see if that happens. See if that happens. So sort of as they've accepted that, they can vote for a Mormon. Will that lead to the next step? Judy.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Oh yeah, of course.
Do you think that maybe part of that, the door not closing, is now the younger generations coming up who didn't live through the God makers? I mean, I didn't even know about that, or
Yeah.
the different things like that, and so they don't have such a bad opinion of the Mormons.
Yeah.
And now as they grow up, they will be just kind of dissipate maybe.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's probably true. I think there are some really interesting things happening with the dialogue. The question is if it's trickling down to the pews. I mean, there are some amazing things that are happening on sort of the level of the academy, or even some of the level of sort of the hierarchy and various organizational leaders. It's hard to know if that's getting down to the people in the pew who might have long-standing, just hard, fast prejudices. But it is interesting to think about a new generation who grows up in a more pluralistic society, and frankly, who sees a Mormonism that has addressed a lot of these issues and has some answers. And I think you're probably right that it might be a generational thing. It'll be interesting to see what happens. And the thing that we can't get away from is perhaps more than ever before, the need for political alliances might be stronger. One of the interesting headlines that came out of the 2012 campaign was that evangelical Christians are no longer the kingmakers of presidents. That even though they had a good turnout and even though they voted in record numbers for Mitt Romney, he didn't win the election. And so this might cause them to rethink, how strong their clout is. And so as some issues about religious freedom or social mores become more to the fore, they might, swallow and shake hands with Mormons, because they need allies. Yes, please.
I have two questions.
Okay.
They're related, I hope.
Okay.
So I'll just go ahead and ask both of them.
Yeah.
The first one is, The latest surveys suggest what in terms of Americans' positive views towards
Great
Mormons?
question.
And the second one that's related is, and this may be total folklore,
Yeah.
but I thought I remembered hearing about some surveys that seem to suggest that if someone who is not Mormon gets to know a Mormon personally, that their favoritism rating tends to decrease.
Oh, wow.
Have you heard anything like that?
I've definitely heard that survey question. This is something that David Campbell and Quinn Monson and John Green have done, and I think they're about to publish their work. But actually, what I'd heard is it was the opposite.
Because I know that's the general trend,
Yeah.
is that if you know somebody, and that's
Yeah.
why this stuck out for me anyway.
That's interesting. I haven't
It
heard
seemed
that.
to be the opposite, but I don't know if I'm just, if I misunderstood this or what.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't heard that result. The survey that these three professors are doing, they're political scientists. So David Campbell's at Notre Dame, Quinn Monson's at BYU, and John Green, I think, is at the University of Akron. They published a preliminary study or preliminary results in 2009, right after the first campaign, and they sort of had an ingenious methodology. They administered a quiz to people. They asked first, how much do you know about Mormonism? And then they administered a quiz about Mormon beliefs and Mormon history, very basic things. And so as sort of a way to gauge how much they really did know. And what they discovered was that the people who knew the most about Mormonism, not self-reported, but who actually knew the most about Mormonism, their favorability or their willingness to consider a Mormon candidate, several other factors they asked, increased sharply. And then they did similar things about interpersonal relationships. They found that really increased feelings of favorability. So that's fascinating.
Yes,
I'm going to have to
just
check
don't know.
that out. I'll
So
have to check
the
it out.
current-
And then the current one.
Most recent, yeah.
Yeah, since 2008, that's when a pollster like Gary Lawrence, he called that upside down. That seems to be another time when the image flipped, so that there was early in 2007 was another low point where it was somewhere in the 20s, so that more people had an unfavorable opinion of Mormons than favorable. And then almost right after the 2008, it flipped again to where it's held steady for about a decade, is in the 46 to 47% range that people are reporting favorable, or various ways it's asked. But more people have favorable opinions, so we have that undecided group, or that sort of, I don't know, no response group. But it's right about 50%. Pew published a poll right after the election, December of the election, and their headline was "Nothing has changed," or something like this. Not much has changed about Mormons. But the interesting thing is, I think they missed the boat. If you read the survey, I think they were wrong. I think they undersold their story, because there was a 14% change, a 14-point change, percentage point change among evangelical Christians in how they felt their religion related to Mormons in a positive way. So that a 14% jump. They're comparing a 2011 survey with a 2012 survey. And there was a 4% general temperature scale, favorability temperature scale jump. So I think that headline sort of belied what they really were finding, that there was a jump, right around 50%. Yes, please.
There's three issues that the LDS Church, in my view, hasn't really handled satisfactorily. The women's issue, the gay issue, and then those hideous racial teachings that they just will not repudiate. Do you think that these three issues can come back to harm them here in the future?
Boy, that's a really good question. I always go wrong when I prognosticate, but yes, I mean, definitely. I think these are potentially troubling issues. I think a lot of us thought this was perhaps going to happen in 2012. Maybe we can think of the race issue first. It seemed like that was going to explode in February of 2012 when there was a really unfortunate Washington Post article that had a professor quoting or sort of rehashing some of the past statements, explanations, justifications for the policy. And it looked like that was going to become the theme of the campaign. But it didn't. And I think what happened, at least one thing that happened, was Jabari Parker at the same time became this rose to the sort of the fore as another famous Mormon. He's this Chicago basketball player who the next month appears on the cover of Sports Illustrated, goes on Katie Couric's show, and is very well known as this Mormon young man. He's a black basketball player. So things like that seem to counteract this feeling of, we sort of speak to Mormon diversity, but that may have been luck and fortuitous timing, because it wasn't something that was very publicly addressed. However, the church issued its strongest statement for sure in sort of repudiating past, at least coming close to repudiating the past, and taking a much more stronger ambiguous tone. And they published the heading for the new official Declaration 2 in this latest edition of the Scriptures. So I think it seems like the church is taking steps. They're very aware of this issue. The feminist issue or issue of women, again, it seems like there was a New York Times piece that seemed to kind of portend the potential critique from the left, and one of those was definitely women's issues. But that didn't seem to explode. But I think we're maybe seeing that happen, come into the press a little bit more, and I think there are signs institutionally that the church is aware of that. So, and then maybe let's say one more thing about the gay issue. Again, such a complex issue, but the church's actions are really interesting. So Proposition 8, on the heels of that, Michael Otterson, the church's managing director of public affairs, goes to the Salt Lake City Council meetings and reads a statement officially endorsing non-discrimination ordinances, and gets a nice endorsement from Equality Utah that the church is a compassionate organization. So I think at least there's some nuance and some complications that you get the sense that they're aware of these three. Do you want to ask a follow-up on that? Looks like you're going to say something.
Well, just in this last conference, two of the apostles were kind of gay bashing.
Yeah. I think it's, without question, these are complicated
Two of the most
issues.
important apostles.
Yeah. So this is going to be something that I am sure
Yeah,
is going to come into
these are
play.
issues that are not going to die.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah. Please.
The sad part about it is that Romney was not seen as authentic,
Yeah.
and I think that spills over into the church.
Yeah.
Also, he didn't make his religion a big thing because, and he missed an opportunity. You know, he avoided questions regarding his religion, and he could have brought that into his candidacy more and would have made him more genuine. But his 47% comment is what cost him his election and his money. You know, when you make $35,000 a day, you know, that gives the image of the church that you have to be powerful and rich, and only the well-off are in the church that are running the church. And I think that what we learned from the election was that Reaganism and the image of Reagan is gone, and they have to reinvent themselves and decide who they really are. And it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, very, very insightful comments. I think that was the reaction after the Republican convention, was even those who were not Romney or Republican supporters were like, this is a different picture of Mitt Romney. Why haven't we been seeing more of this? And in that sense, that's where I think the church maybe did transcend this, so that there was a space for those who were saying, this is not Mormonism, this is what you are seeing is not Mormonism, and that seemed to get significant airtime. How it's going to play out, I think, remains to be seen. But I think you're right that there was at least a sense that Mormonism can be different than that picture of inauthenticity or wealth and power, whether it was fair or not.
Kind of a related question. What about, there were other Mormons in the 2012 picture, like Harry Reid and John Huntsman. His grandfather was an apostle.
Yeah.
What kind of public perception? I mean, it's almost like they were invisible.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's a good insight. You know, and I think part of it is because of maybe the way John Huntsman, his personal stance to his religion, I think sort of it just initially kind of took out that as a characteristic, as an attribute. plus the fact that he may not have been seen as a viable candidate from fairly early on, that he sort of diminished into the background. But maybe more so, just his own personal stance and questions about his commitment, all that were circulating in the press. Harry Reid's an interesting one. I think only 6% of Americans polled could identify Harry Reid's religion, maybe up through 2010. But yet, and this maybe speaks to some earlier comments, is that he came out quite publicly endorsing Gregory Prince's editorial that Mitt Romney is not the face of my Mormonism. And that was a really interesting moment where I think he more publicly took ownership of his faith, and so that increased that profile, but also I think highlighted diversity within Mormonism. So I think that did bump up, but you're right. I think all those factors, Mitt Romney definitely got the most attention. Kurt.
Well, I just wanted to clarify, are there Mormons who don't make $35,000?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
No, I'm curious, your title is Mormons in the American mind.
Yeah.
So what about Mormons in the Mormon mind?
Wow.
Or Mormon image?
Yeah.
Did you do much, did you look at, kind of take the temperature of church members and how they're weathering all of this?
That's a great question. Much of the study feels very much like an impressionistic study. I mean, this is a tough target to hit, and so much of it is trying to piece together the evidence. The polling has been a little sporadic, and Mormons don't always register in polls, but maybe one thing that addresses this is I'm really grateful to a lot of people who sat for interviews and a lot of oral histories, and so in some ways I think if we look at this image making as a dialogue process with a few main actors, the institutional church is one, the media is another, the other religious groups and their interaction with Mormons, but one that I think is really interesting is this idea of individual Mormons. And so I did try to weave them in as a dialogue partner. Celebrity Mormons, former Mormons, cultural Mormons, Mormon dissidents, some that would consider themselves in the loyal opposition that are still within the church but offer critique. And so I think throughout, again, it's impressionistic, but we do hear the voices of those who aren't in favor of initiatives or strategies or directives or offer a critique to political positions and church public relations positions, and to get a sense of where they're coming from. So I hope we do give adequate space to this really important role of other Mormons, not necessarily feeling comfortable with the direction we're going, or offering critique, or offering new directions. That's a great question. So that's probably the best way it's addressed there. Okay, Clint, and then we'll come here to these three.
You talked about how the church changed maybe in terms of their openness with President Hinckley coming on the scene. With his passing and now President Monson, do you feel like the church has maintained that level of presence in the media? Do you feel like it's pulled back a little or expanded that role?
That's another really good question. My sense is that journalists feel, this is super, painted with super broad strokes, that they feel like that maybe from the church's hierarchy that the church is not as involved in the media, but perhaps that they are more active in terms of an institution, so from like the public affairs department, so that there is maybe a stronger presence and more accessibility, things like that in terms of the institution, but less from the office of the First Presidency. Just because of President Hinckley's, I think, natural proclivities and just his experience. So it's kind of an interesting time. But I think that's okay, because I think from the church's perspective, I think what's happened is that the church is feeling like that there are a lot more independent Mormon voices, and they're happy to let that happen. So that there's this new proliferation of experts that the media turns to who can speak from within Mormonism, as opposed to just looking to experts on the outside looking in. So it's kind of an interesting change.
I thought one of the most interesting sources that you had was the public affairs files. I wonder if you talk a little bit about, were they good to work with there? Were the things that you would like to see and that couldn't? Were the things that you hoped that the files would be able to shed light on that didn't?
They were great to work with, but they can, I don't want to give them any blame for what happened and what turned out, but they were fantastic to work with. I mean, I think just, by the nature of their work, they're really good at being kind and open and conversational, and they were pretty generous in the type of things that they let me see, and so I was really satisfied and really grateful for what I was allowed to look at, and in reality they opened everything and were quite open in the things that they allowed me to use. So. And so I in terms of satisfaction, I think that what it demonstrated was a really sort of clear philosophical trajectory, and that I think we've seen manifested in their strategies. Moving from, maybe we could say, counting the number of times Mormons are mentioned in news stories around the country, so news clippings, thousands of news clippings being mailed in, to now taking a very sort of careful approach to fostering relationships with key individuals that they feel like there's mutual benefit in fostering relationships. Please, in the back.
Going back to when the ban was lifted on the priesthood, I know it was a big deal in the church, but in the general public, did it make any kind of impact? Did they even know?
Yeah, I'm at the risk of understating this. No, it was really interesting. I mean, it was this sort of flash in the pan that this stop the press moments, the moments, so that Time and Newsweek are stopping their presses to make this announcement. It's front page news, but then that was it. It almost had this feeling of it's about time, and we knew that eventually Mormons would get here, and so moving on.
Is that the same way with the ERA?
Well, maybe. It just seems like with the ERA that somehow there seemed to be some other things that were going on. There just didn't seem to be, this is what even maybe some historians of the ERA who themselves were involved in the moment looked at, is that just didn't seem to be a case, they didn't make the case to the nation that the ERA was necessary, so that the amendment itself had fizzled out, so that it had almost, generally speaking, had lost the hold of the nation's attention. And so maybe Mormonism just sort of figured into a footnote because just sort of general disinterest momentum. I think what's interesting is that the moment where there was so much interest on Mormonism in the priesthood was 70 and 71. And so by the time it came along in 78, that attention had already passed. So, yes, please, Brent.
Well, couldn't it be that I think to the average Americans, Mormonism is but a small, insignificant mole on society, and I think that's why they give us a pass on all this stuff. If we were this big, threat or something, and the black issue came up or the gay issue, I think they would hammer us into the ground and wouldn't give up on us.
Yeah, and I think that characterizes what happened in the 70s and early 80s. It's really interesting to compare the reaction to Proposition 8 as compared to the Equal Rights Amendment, so that Mormons sort of figure into like this footnote as sort of a coalition partner to Phyllis Schlafly and other people. But then in Proposition 8, Mormons as the coalition, they become the target. They're the group that everyone notices. I wonder if that reflects a flip, so that some Mormons are seen now as more relevant and more powerful. So that in the 80s, the mid-80s, we have America's Saints being written, or the Mormon corporate empire, and they looked at one of their major points. These writers are looking at this ERA movement and saying this reflects Mormon power. And perhaps it seemed irrelevant and kind of small then, but maybe what we're seeing in the Proposition 8 backlash is a new relevance where it seems like Mormonism is bigger than its numbers. So it's really interesting to see that contrast. Yes, please.
Yeah, in 97, I think 98, when President Hinckley went on 60 Minutes. And
Oh, yeah, right.
A few times later that. Did that help the image, or did it kind of raise more questions for the public, or what did you find?
Definitely, it definitely helped. And so this was right from the beginning. And what I think it helped is that I think it colored every other subsequent media interview. So this is really early on. He's meeting with at the Harvard Club. His first year of his administration. That's when he meets Mike Wallace. Agrees to go on 60 Minutes. So it's airing in 1 year after he's been the president of the church. And because he addressed all of the hard questions, allowed Mike Wallace to ask them, it seemed that subsequent meetings with President Hinckley almost went that same way. And he had really, sort of really candid, but at the same time, he just pretty dismissive answers. That he was very good at just sloughing it off, and then portraying a forward-looking church. And so I think that seemed to color the rest of the media interviews subsequently, and changed this feeling of a church that's so closed as to one that's now open. And we'll give an interview to anyone.
Yeah.
That's a great question, Gary.
This maybe is too early for you to offer an opinion, but I'd be interested to know what you personally think the impact of the Book of Mormon musical will be.
I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, we have a section on the Book of Mormon musical in there, and I think this is one of those wild stories that probably many of you remember hearing about the Book of Mormon musical before it came out, and every report seemed to talk about how this was going to be the most vulgar musical that had ever shown on a Broadway play. I mean, they were just talking about how they couldn't even, play excerpts from the songs because it would, violate FCC guidelines for profanity. And so, I mean, you just have this feeling. There's even people who weren't Mormons in the media are talking about this. This seems frightening to take a religious text and subject it to this kind of vulgar treatment. But then it totally flipped. So that we have this people coming out saying, yes, there are places that are going to make you flinch, and this is raunchy, but the Mormons come out looking sweet. And perhaps the most interesting part of this is the church's response. This is again from Scott Swafford, but he saw a direct tie, and I don't think the church was actually shy about this at all, but it prompted them to launch I Am a Mormon that was only in a few test markets to launch it nationwide. And so Scott Swafford said there was a 24-hour turnaround, the quickest turnaround he's ever seen in church administration, where they presented the idea of let's take this nationwide, let's take it to Times Square, and it was approved in 24 hours by the church's hierarchy. And so traffic to Mormon.org tripled that summer. And so I think it had just a remarkable effect of creating interest. And the fact that that the Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators, they just loved the church's response. They loved how the church was clever in saying, the musical may entertain for a night, but the book will change your life forever. Or that the church buys ad space in the Playbill in L.A. I mean, they just said that's a really cool response, and I think that scored points for the church in terms of its savvy. Greg?
Well, first, congratulations on your book. I want to talk, if you might talk about methodology. What I really like you as a researcher is that you go from South Park to Charlene Wells to President Hinckley to Godmakers to statistical analysis, and that you really, especially getting Oxford University Press to pick this book up, I think have that kind of significance beyond even the topic. I just wanted if you discuss just exactly how Oxford University Press takes this manuscript of yours, even through your dissertation process. I wonder if they had the same kind of, basically just very even keel academic gaze and very unprejudicial gaze on sources, the way that you seem to have. And if you would talk about just exactly how that process works. If they were willing to take all the sources, the variety of sources that you take, and put it into basically an academic analysis, if they were okay with that, if that's something you had to help them along and bring them to, or how that process
that's
goes.
a great question. And first, since he's sitting by me, I got to say, for all so many great sources came from my brother-in-law Clint Weston. So he's was my media source. He's a great observer of all things Mormonism, so he deserves another credit line. But
basically, he's saying, "I watch too much TV."
Yeah, I think that there's just no question that I owe so much to so many incredible researchers and writers and thinkers who paved the way, and who you know, this is really coming on the heels of so many great thinkers who have shown the value of media studies, of sort of kind of impressionistic perception studies, and so I think that's really what it did, was that they had, and even and especially in Mormonism, Mormon studies, that they were really willing to consider something that looked this way. Not because of my own merits, but because of other people.
But just from the first look at your book, it's very well footnoted. Do you feel like because of the nature of the sources, that you were kind of needed to kind of validate those sources and explain those sources in the footnotes more, or do you feel like, you know, Oxford University Press and most places are now at a place where they'll basically accept all sources without any sort of bias or any sort of preconceptions?
Well, that's a good question. You know, yeah, I think definitely there are some places where the reviewers, you know, wanted to see more or asked about some things, but I also think that there's enough body of work, and this group knows it better than anyone, this kind of corpus of Mormon scholarship that I think has established itself as legitimate. And that's part of the story, and I think maybe in the end might be the longest lasting part of the story, is that academic interest in Mormonism may be the thing that fuels the next Mormon moment, that this has become established, a relevant topic in college campuses and bookstores and conversations around the country. So I think that's going to happen. Kurt, do we have time for one more? Okay.
I was just going to say, let's not forget with the Olympics that Salt Lake Committee was paid to get that. That didn't make the church look very credible. And remember, Romney is seen as the great animal of government, and now he's going to the federal government, and that's why the cash flowed, is because the government funded it.
Yeah.
And so he didn't look credible there, and he's also with his Massachusetts health care law, again going against Obama, who's doing the same thing. So I think that's why he wasn't authentic. He didn't walk the talk.
Yeah, maybe two thoughts on that. I think
yeah.
This is one interesting.
That'll be the last one. We really are out of time. After you answer.
I think it's interesting that this idea that flip-flopper was one of these things that really stuck with Mitt Romney, and this was one place where the Mormon image kind of came in, is that a lot of people were saying, well, this makes sense that a Mormon would be a flip-flopper, because they are the quintessential nice facade, wolves in sheep clothing, so it makes sense. That was interesting that there were some that made that association. But the Olympics is interesting because this idea of the scandal, and again, just how it's going to play out long term, but how it seems to have played out, was that instead of it giving the Mormons a black eye, it sort of seemed like it came out saying that, it finally came out that the way Olympics have always been run has been corrupt, and it makes sense that that would be exposed in Salt Lake, and here's an Olympics that we can see turn the tide. So that became the storyline, interestingly enough, about this scandal, so that in some ways it turned out to be a plus, saying now we see Salt Lake doing it different. Now they've cleaned up their act, and so it was one of those interesting storylines, I think, boosted the way, like I think it was the Chicago Tribune said, that everyone looked nutty except for the Mormons, and they looked golden. I love that line. So thanks for your comments.
Thank you very much.